Hello, it's great to have you here. If you enjoy thrilling romances, please like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any stories. The world had shrunk to the size of a buffalo hide tipi, and the patch of sky visible through its smoke hole. For Florence, even that was too large, too full of a life she no longer wished to be a part of. The scent of wood smoke and roasting meat, once a comforting aroma of home and hearth, was now a constant, nauseating reminder of everything she had lost. It was the smell of survival, and survival was a betrayal to the dead. She sat on a bed of soft furs, her back pressed against the tipi's taut wall, knees drawn up to her chest. Her dress, once a respectable blue calico, was torn and stained with the dust of the Dakota plains. Her reddish-brown hair, usually pinned in a neat coil, hung in tangled, matted ropes around her shoulders. But it was her eyes, a deep cornflower blue, that held the true landscape of her desolation. They were vacant, fixed on a point beyond the tipi walls, beyond the bustling village, replaying the horror of the raid over and over. The thunder of hooves, the piercing cries, the flash of her father's desperate, protective face before he fell. Her mother's hand ripped from her own. The world had ended in a storm of dust and violence, and she, inexplicably, had been left behind in the quiet aftermath. They had brought her here, to this village of people whose language was like the rustle of wind through dry grass, whose faces were like carved stone. They were not cruel, not in the way she had been taught to fear. They gave her space, left her to the solitude of her grief, but they also expected her to live, and that she could not do. Her defiance had taken the form of silence and starvation. It was the only power she had left. They could take her freedom, her family, her future, but they could not force a morsel of food past her lips. It was a slow, quiet rebellion, a final act of loyalty to those who could no longer eat, or breathe, or dream. Her guardian was a warrior named Tokala. He was as silent as she was, but his silence was different. Hers was a void, his was a presence. He was a tall man, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the sky, and hair as black and gleaming as a raven's wing. His face was all sharp angles and stoic lines, but his eyes were dark and deep, and they saw everything. They were not cruel or mocking, but watchful, intensely watchful. 3 times a day he would enter her tipi, ducking his head to pass through the low flap. He never spoke. He would simply place a wooden bowl before her, filled with whatever the village was. Eating stewed rabbit, roasted bison, a handful of tart wild berries. He would also bring a skin of fresh water. Then he would retreat to a spot just inside the entrance, sit cross-legged, and wait, and Florence would ignore him. She would not look at the food, would not acknowledge his presence. She would continue her vigil, staring into the abyss of her memory, her body a rigid fortress of refusal. After a time, Tokala would rise as silently as he had entered, take the untouched bowl, and leave. This ritual had repeated itself for days. Florence wasn't sure how many. The sun rose and set, painting the tipi's hide in shades of gold and gray, but the passage of time had lost all meaning. She felt herself growing lighter, her body becoming a fragile shell. A faint dizziness was her constant companion, and at times the sounds of the village, the laughter of children, the rhythmic beat of a distant drum seemed to come from a great, echoing distance. This was it, she thought, with a strange sense of peace. This was how she would rejoin her family. Today the dizziness was worse. When Tokala entered, the world tilted precariously. He set down the bowl, and the smell of savory bison meat was so strong it made her stomach clench in a painful, involuntary knot of hunger. She squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the primal urge to eat. No, I will not. I will not live in their world. She heard a rustle of movement, not of him leaving, but of someone else entering. She opened her eyes to see another warrior standing beside Tokala. This one was shorter, broader, with a restless energy that seemed to fill the small space. His face was set in a permanent scowl, and his eyes, unlike Tokala's, held a sharp, undisguised hostility as they landed on her. "This is foolishness, Tokala," the man said, his voice a low growl in the Lakota tongue. Florence didn't understand the words, but the tone was universal. He was angry. "She is dying, wasting our food, our time." Tokala remained silent, his gaze fixed on Florence. The other warrior, Wabin, gestured impatiently at her. "She's a ghost already. If she will not eat, then force her, or let the spirits take her. She's a White Eyes, a child of the invaders. Her death means nothing." Florence watched the exchange, her heart beating a little faster. Force her. The thought sent a spike of fear through her foggy mind. Her protest was passive. It relied on their unwillingness to be brutal. If that changed. Tokala finally turned his head, his dark eyes meeting Wabin's. He spoke, and his voice was deeper than Florence had expected, calm and measured, yet carrying an undeniable authority. The words were lost on her, but the effect was not. Wabon's aggressive posture faltered slightly. He argued back, his words sharper, more urgent. Tokala responded, with only a few quiet words. A standoff crackled in the air between them, a battle of wills played out in a language she could not comprehend. Finally, with a grunt of disgust, Wabon spun on his heel and left the tipi, throwing the flap back with such force that it slapped against the hide wall. They were alone again. Florence felt a tremor run through her. The confrontation had drained what little strength she had left. The darkness, at the edge of her vision, was creeping closer. She felt her body begin to sway, and she braced herself for the impact with the ground, but it never came. A hand, strong and warm, shot out and gripped her upper arm, steadying her. The contact was like a bolt of lightning, a sudden shocking intrusion of life into her carefully constructed tomb of grief. She flinched, her head snapping up to look at Tokala. He'd moved from his spot by the entrance without making a sound. He was kneeling in front of her now, his face only a few feet from hers. His grip was firm but not painful. It was simply solid, an anchor in her spinning world. His expression was unchanged, still stoic, still unreadable, but his eyes held a new intensity. He was no longer just watching. He was seeing her, seeing the fragile thread by which her life now hung. Slowly, deliberately, he released her arm. He reached for the wooden bowl, his movements economical and precise. He picked up a small piece of the roasted bison with his fingers and held it out to her. It was not a command. It was not a threat. It was an offering. The scent of the meat was overwhelming. Her body screamed for it, for the salt, the fat, the sustenance. Her stomach cramped violently. Tears pricked her eyes, tears of hunger, of weakness, of sheer, stubborn misery. She turned her head away, a sharp, defiant gesture. She set her jaw, tasting the bitter tang of her own resolve. She would not break. She would die, as Florence Miller, daughter of Joseph and Grace, not as a nameless, well-fed captive. She heard him exhale, a soft, quiet sound. She expected him to leave. She expected him to finally give up, but he did not. He remained kneeling before her, the offering of food still extended in his hand. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. It was no longer just the absence of sound. It was a conversation. His patience against her pain, his persistence against her refusal. In the quiet confines of the tipi, a silent war was being waged, not for her body, but for her will to live. And as the shadows lengthened outside, Florence began to fear it was a war she was losing. The sun bled through the hide of the tipi, shifting from the harsh white of midday to the softer gold of late afternoon. Time, for Florence, was measured only in the slow crawl of light and the deepening ache in her belly. She and Tokala remained locked in their silent tableau. The defiant, fading captive and the patient, unmoving warrior. His arm, holding the piece of bison, was as steady as a granite ledge. He did not waver, did not speak, did not show any sign of frustration. He simply waited, his presence a quiet, unyielding pressure against her resolve. Florence's world had begun to fray at the edges. The sounds of the village became a dull, meaningless hum. Dark spots danced in her vision. Her own thoughts were sluggish, circling the same drain of grief and loss. Father, mother. The names were a silent prayer, a mantra of her martyrdom. To eat would be to forget them. To live would be to accept a world without them. Her body was a battlefield, and her will was the last tattered flag she could fly. But the body had its own betrayals. The scent of the meat was a constant torment. Saliva pooled in her mouth, a humiliating response she could not control. Her stomach twisted into knots of pure, animalistic need. She felt a profound sense of shame, as if her own physical self was siding with the enemy. She watched Tokala through her lashes. His face, which she had first seen as a mask of savage indifference, now held a different quality. It was a study in stillness. He wasn't looking at her with aggression or even pity. He was watching her with an unnerving focus, as if he were reading the last pages of a book and trying to commit them to memory. He was watching her die. A wave of cold dread washed over her, colder than the hunger. She was succeeding. Her plan was working, and it terrified her. As the light inside the tipi turned a dusky orange, something in Tokala shifted. It wasn't a large movement, just a slow lowering of his arm. He placed the piece of meat back into the bowl. "It's giving up," Florence thought, a strange mix of triumph and disappointment fluttering in her chest. But he did not rise to leave. Instead, he drew the bowl closer to himself. With the same deliberate grace, he picked up the piece of meat he had offered her and ate it himself. He chewed slowly, his gaze never leaving her face. Then he picked up another piece and ate that too. He was not taunting her. His actions were devoid of malice. He was simply eating, sharing the space, sharing the meal, but alone. He was demonstrating the simple, profound act of living that she had rejected. When he was finished, he did not take the bowl away. He pushed it gently back to the center of the space between them. The message was clear. The offering still stands. The choice is still yours. Florence felt a cracked form in the icy wall around her heart. His persistence was a language all its own. He refused to let her go, refused to accept her silent wish for death. Why? Why did this stranger care if she faded into nothing? Wabun's words, though she hadn't understood them, had carried a clear intent: let her die. That was the logical path. She was an enemy, a burden. Tokala's quiet refusal to follow that path was the most confusing, most unsettling thing that had happened since her capture. He saw the flicker of conflict in her eyes. He must have, because what he did next shattered her world completely. He reached into a small leather pouch that hung from his belt. It was a simple deerskin bag, worn smooth with use. His large, calloused fingers, which she had only imagined as capable of wielding weapons, moved with surprising delicacy. He drew out a small object and held it in his palm. Florence's breath caught in her throat. It was a doll, a crude thing carved from a piece of pale cottonwood. It was no bigger than his hand, a simple figure of a girl, with bits of dark horsehair for hair and a tiny faded dress made from a scrap of blue tradecloth. It was worn, smoothed by the touch of small hands, its features barely visible from years of being cherished. Tokala held it out on his open palm, not for her to take, but for her to see. And for the first time since she had met him, his mask of stoicism broke. A profound sadness, a grief so deep it seemed to carve new lines into his face, washed over his features. His dark eyes softened with an ancient, unbearable pain. He looked from the doll in his hand to her face. Then he lifted his other hand and pressed it flat against his own heart. He held it there for a long moment, his chest rising and falling in a single deep breath. He then moved that hand, pointing from his heart to the doll, and then to her. He didn't need words. The gesture transcended language, culture, and the violence that stood between them. It was a bridge of shared human experience thrown across the chasm of their enmity. "I know this pain," his gesture said. "I have lost. You have lost. This emptiness you feel. I feel it too." A sob, raw and powerful, ripped through Florence's chest. It was the first sound she had made in days, a ragged, ugly noise that tore at her throat. Tears she thought had long run dry streamed down her face, hot and cleansing. The fortress she had built around herself crumbled into dust. He was not just a captor. He was not a savage. He was a man who had known a loss so great that he carried its ghost in a leather pouch at his side. A daughter, a sister. It didn't matter. What mattered was the truth in his eyes. He understood. Her trembling hand, seemingly of its own volition, reached out, not for the doll, but for the bowl. Her fingers, thin and weak, fumbled as she picked up the smallest piece of meat. It felt impossibly heavy. She lifted it to her lips, her entire body shaking with the effort, with the magnitude of the surrender. She put the food in her mouth. The taste was explosive, overwhelming. Salt, fat, smoke. It was the taste of the earth, of fire, of life itself. It was the taste of a future she hadn't asked for, but one that was now, undeniably, hers to bear. Swallowing was difficult, a painful journey down a throat long unused, but she did it. She swallowed. Through the blur of her tears, she saw Tokala. The deep sadness was still in his eyes, but a new light flickered within it, not victory, but a profound, solemn relief. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He carefully placed the little wooden doll back into its pouch, tucking his own grief away once more. He rose, his movements as fluid and silent as a shadow. He took the now used bowl and left her tipi, leaving Florence alone, with the lingering taste of bison and the earth-shattering realization that in the heart of her enemy, she had found the one thing she thought had vanished from the world, a shared soul. Folks, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Write your city and state here in the comments so I can send a shout out. The first bite was a surrender. The ones that followed were a fragile treaty. In the days after her breakthrough, a new rhythm established itself, as quiet and deliberate as Tokala's own movements. He would bring her food, and she would eat, not with appetite, not with pleasure, but with a grim determination that was its own form of survival. Her grief had not vanished. It had simply changed shape. It was no longer a sharp, suicidal edge, but a dull, heavy stone she now had to learn to carry. With nourishment, however meager, came a slow return of awareness. The world outside the tipi began to filter back in, no longer a muted hum, but a symphony of distinct sounds, the yipping of dogs, the high-pitched laughter of children at play, the soft scrape of a hide being prepared, the murmur of voices, speaking a language that was like music and stone. She began to distinguish individuals, associating voices with the figures she glimpsed through the tipi flap. Her world was still small, but Tokala was at its center. He was no longer just a silent guard. He was the man who had shown her his own broken heart to mend a piece of hers. That act had changed everything. The fear she held for him had been replaced by a wary, profound curiosity. The lessons began without announcement. One morning he set down a bowl of stewed corn and rabbit. As she reached for it, he pointed to the bowl and said a single word, his voice low and clear. Wixu Florence paused, looking from the bowl to his face. He was watching her, his expression expectant. He pointed again. Wixu. She understood. She pointed, a hesitant finger, at the corn. Corn, she whispered, her own voice rusty. He nodded slowly. He then gestured to the water skin. In water, she replied, a little stronger this time. This became their ritual. With every meal, he gave her new words. Taiatar for the bison that formed the core of their diet. Pieta for the fire that cooked it. Marpia for the vast, endless sky she could see through the smoke hole. Her tongue stumbled over the guttural consonants and nasal vowels, so different from the soft sounds of English. But he was endlessly patient, correcting her pronunciation with a quiet repetition until she got it right. In return, she began to offer him her own words. Fire, she would say, pointing to the glowing embers in the center of the tipi. Sky. He would listen intently, his dark eyes narrowed in concentration, and then repeat the English words in a deep, resonant voice. The foreign sounds seemed to fit strangely well in his mouth. This slow exchange of language began to build a delicate scaffold of understanding between them. Each new word was a plank laid across the chasm of their different worlds. She learned that Tokala meant fox, a name that suited his quiet, observant nature. She learned that his people called themselves Lakota, the allies. She learned words for family, ate for father, Aina for mother, and when she repeated them, the stone of her own grief felt impossibly heavy in her chest. One afternoon, when she had regained more of her strength, he gestured for her to follow him outside. Hesitantly, she pushed aside the tipi flap and stepped into the sunlight. The brightness was blinding, and the sheer scale of the village, nestled in a bend of a wide, shallow river, was overwhelming. Dozens of tipis stood in a great circle, smoke curling lazily from their peaks. Women worked on hides, children chased each other through the tall grass, and groups of men spoke quietly, their gazes occasionally flicking toward her, the white captive. She felt a spike of the old fear, but Tokala's presence beside her was a solid, reassuring shield. He led her away from the main camp, up a gentle rise that overlooked the rolling plains. The land stretched out in every direction, an ocean of green and gold, and the immense blue bowl of the sky. It was beautiful, terrifyingly so. He stood beside her, silent for a long moment, letting her take it all in. Then, he pointed to the east, toward the direction from which her family's wagon had come. The Iron Road, he said, using the English words she had taught him. He then drew a long, straight line in the dirt with the toe of his moccasin. He drew another line parallel to it. It cuts the land. It scares the tea at Akka. He then began to sketch in the dirt, his drawings simple but clear. He drew squares, fences, he said, another of her words. He drew lines through the squares, chopping up the vast, open space he had first drawn. They say the land is theirs, but the land belongs to no one. It is for all. Florence stared at the crude map, her heart beginning to pound. She had seen those fences. Her own father had planned to build them, to stake his claim, to tame a piece of this wild country for their own. The idea had seemed so noble then, so full of hope and progress. Tokala wiped the drawings away with his foot. He looked at her, and his eyes were not angry, but filled with a deep, weary sorrow. The bison are our life, he said, mixing Lakota and English. Tiatai Kar is food, home tools, Wikazani, life. The white eyes kill them and leave them to rot, for sport, for skins. He made a gesture of something being stripped away and discarded. Soon there will be none left. Soon the Lakota will starve. The truth of his words settled upon her with the force of a physical blow. The raid. It hadn't been a random act of savagery. It hadn't been mindless violence. It had been an act of desperation. An act of war, yes, but a war for survival. The line she had always drawn between her civilized world and their savage one began to dissolve like a sand painting in the rain. Who were the true savages? The people fighting to protect their homes and their food, or the people who would plow under a whole way of life for a piece of fenced-in dirt? Their quiet lessons and walks did not go unnoticed. She was acutely aware of Wabun's eyes following them, his face a thundercloud of suspicion. He saw Tokala speaking to her, saw the careful way he guided her over uneven ground, and his disapproval was a palpable force. One evening, as Tokala brought her meal, Wabun followed him into the tipi, his presence immediately sucking the air out of the small space. "You teach her our tongue," Wabun demanded in Lakota, his voice sharp with accusation. "You share the words of the people with an enemy." Tokala calmly set Florence's bowl down before answering. "She is not an enemy. She's a woman who has lost everything. She learns, so she might understand." "Understand what?" Wabun sneered. "That we are fools. That our strongest warrior can be softened by a pale face and blue eyes. You shame us, Tokala. You shame the memory of those the whites have killed. She is a snake we have warmed by our fire." Florence watched them, understanding more from their tone and posture than from the few words she could pick out. Wabun's aggression was obvious, as was Tokala's infuriating calm. "Your anger makes you blind, Wabun," Tokala said, his voice level. "You see only the color of her skin. I see a heart that carries the same sorrow as our own sorrow." Wabun laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Her people bring the sorrow. They bring the sickness, the iron horse, the fences that strangle our mother, the earth. Her sorrow is nothing." He took a step toward Florence, his hand balling into a fist. "She should be a slave or dead, not a student." Before he could take another step, Tokala moved. He was not fast, but he was absolute. He simply placed himself between Wabun and Florence, a silent, immovable wall. He did not raise his voice or his hands. He did not need to. His presence alone was a challenge, and the look in his eyes promised violence he held expertly in check. "She is under my protection," Tokala stated, the words falling like chips of stone. "You will not touch her. You will not threaten her." Wabun's chest heaved, his face contorted with rage. For a tense moment, the air crackled, and Florence was sure a fight would erupt. But Wabun, for all his bluster, could not meet the steady, dangerous calm in Tokala's gaze. With a final, venomous glare that encompassed them both, he spun around and stormed out of the tipi. The silence he left behind was heavy with unspoken threats. Florence looked at Tokala's broad back, at the way his shoulders were still tensed for a fight. He had defended her, not as a piece of property, but as a person. He had called her a woman with a sorrow like his own. Slowly, he turned back to face her. The hardness in his eyes softened as his gaze met hers. He looked from her to the untouched bowl of food, and then back again. In that look, a new understanding passed between them. The lessons were no longer just about words, and the danger was no longer just from her grief, but from the world outside, a world that saw their fragile connection as a betrayal. The fragile peace was broken a few nights later. A cold wind swept down from the north, rattling the tipi poles and carrying the scent of rain. Florence was huddled under a thick bison robe, the glow of the central fire's embers casting dancing shadows on the hide walls. A sense of unease had settled over the village since the confrontation with Wabun, a tension that hummed just beneath the surface of daily life. She saw it in the hard stares of Wabun's friends and felt it in the way some of the women would fall silent when she drew water from the river. The tipi flap was thrown open with a violent slash, not the respectful duck of Tokala's entrance. Wabun stood there, silhouetted against the dark, stormy sky. Two other warriors, their faces grim, flanked him. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced Florence's heart. Tokala was not there. He was at a council meeting with the elders. "Come," Waban commanded in broken English, his voice laced with triumph. "No more talk. You are a bad spirit here." He lunged for her, his fingers closing round her arm in a brutal grip. Florence cried out, a sound of both pain and terror, struggling against him. Her strength was nothing compared to his. He hauled her from her bed of furs, dragging her toward the entrance. His companions watched, their expressions unyielding. "Let go of me," she screamed, the English words useless but hurled like stones. Suddenly, a figure filled the entrance, blocking Waban's path. It was Tokala. He must have heard her cry. His face, illuminated by the firelight, was a mask of cold fury unlike anything Florence had ever seen. The calm he always wore had been stripped away, revealing the raw, lethal warrior beneath. "Release her, Waban." Tokala's voice was dangerously low, a growl that vibrated through the small space. Waban shoved Florence behind him, positioning himself between her and Tokala. "She's a poison in this village, Tokala. You are bewitched by her. The council talks while she weakens us from within. I am doing what must be done. She will be traded to the Crow for horses, or left on the prairie. It is over. It is over when I say it is over," Tokala countered, taking a slow, deliberate step into the tipi. "She is my captive, my responsibility. You have no right. You have forfeited your right by treating her like a wife instead of a slave." Waban spat, his hand dropping to the knife at his belt. "You dishonor us. You dishonor yourself." The challenge was laid. The air crackled, thick with the promise of violence. Waban drew his knife, its blade glinting in the firelight. Tokala did not reach for his own weapon. Instead, he moved with the blurring speed of a striking fox. The fight was brutal and short. Kalala sidestepped Waban's wild slash, using the man's own momentum to twist his arm behind his back. The knife clattered to the ground. Tokala spun him around, a powerful strike to the jaw sending Waban staggering back into one of his companions. Before Waban could recover, Tokala was on him, not with the intent to kill, but to dominate. He forced Waban to the ground, his forearm pressed hard against his throat, pinning him. The other two warriors, seeing the swift, absolute defeat of their leader, made no move to interfere. Tokala leaned down, his face close to Waban's. He spoke in rapid, hushed Lakota, his words a torrent of controlled rage. Florence couldn't understand them, but she saw the effect. Waban's eyes, wide with shock and pain, lost their fire. The fight drained out of him, replaced by the bitter shame of public defeat. Slowly, Tokala rose, releasing him. He stood tall, his chest heaving, his gaze sweeping over the two other warriors, daring them to move. They remained frozen. He then turned to Waban, who was pushing himself to a sitting position, and offered a final quiet command. Waban and his companions scurried out of the tipi, vanishing into the night like beaten dogs. Silence descended, broken only by the whistling wind and Florence's own ragged breathing. Kala stood for a long moment, his back to her, his shoulders rising and falling as he brought his battle rage under control. When he finally turned, the fury was gone from his eyes, replaced by a deep, aching concern. He knelt before her, his hands gently taking her arm where Waban had gripped her. Dark bruises were already beginning to form. His touch was incredibly gentle, a stark contrast to the violence she had just witnessed. "He did not hurt you?" he asked, his English halting but clear. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You came." He looked into her eyes, and in that moment, the last wall between them crumbled. This was not about a captive and her guard. He had not fought for his property or his honor. He had fought for her. The realization bloomed in her chest, a warm, terrifying, and beautiful thing. The next morning, Tokala led her to the center of the village, where the elders, a council of gray-haired, dignified men, were gathered around the main fire. Waban was there, his face sullen and bruised, avoiding her gaze. The entire village seemed to be watching. Tokala spoke to the elders for a long time. He spoke with passion and conviction, his voice rising and falling with the rhythm of his argument. He gestured to Florence, then to Waban, then to the vast lands around them. He was pleading a case she knew, and her life hung in the balance. When he finished, the oldest of the chiefs, a man with a face like a weathered map, turned his wise, dark eyes to her. He spoke in Lakota, and Tokala translated. He says the path of blood and hate has brought us only sorrow. He says your heart and Tokala's heart now speak the same language. He says the Lakota do not hold a woman against her will. Tokala paused, his own gaze searching hers, his heart in his eyes. The chief gives you a choice, Florence. He pointed to a group of men preparing to leave the village for a trading post to the south, one frequented by whites. They will take you there. You can return to your world. You can be free. Florence looked at the traders, at the path that would lead her back to everything she had ever known. A world of fences and iron roads, of people who would see her as tainted, broken by her time with the savages. A world without the quiet strength of the man standing before her. Then Tokala turned and gestured to the village around them, to the river glistening in the morning sun, to the tipi that had become her strange sanctuary. Or, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, thick with emotion, you can choose a new home. You can be free. Here. The choice. It was the one thing she thought she'd never have again. Freedom to leave, or freedom to stay. She looked at Waban, who now watched her with a grudging respect born of Tokala's strength. She looked at the curious faces of the women and children. This world was hard, it was dangerous, and it was fighting for its very existence. But it was also honest. It was a world where a heart was judged not by the color of its skin, but by the sorrow it carried and the love it was willing to give. She looked back at Tokala, at the silent warrior who had seen her not as a captive, but as a soul adrift. The man who had shared his own deepest grief to save her from hers. The man who had just risked everything to protect her. In his eyes she did not see a captor. She saw her future. She saw home. A slow smile, the first genuine smile since before the raid, touched her lips. She took a step, not toward the traders, but toward Tokala. She reached out and placed her hand on his forearm, a simple gesture that was an answer, a promise, and a beginning. I am home, she said, the words clear and steady in the quiet morning air. Tokala's stoic face broke into a rare, breathtaking smile. He covered her hand with his own, his grip warm and strong. A murmur went through the assembled crowd, a sound of acceptance, of a circle being made whole. Florence knew her life would never be easy, but as she stood beside Tokala, his hand holding hers, she also knew, with absolute certainty, that her heart would never be captive again. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to confirm your subscription and leave a like. It helps us a lot. The deepest connections are often forged in the fires of shared sorrow. True understanding transcends language and prejudice, reminding us that empathy is the most powerful bridge between two worlds. Love is not about finding a perfect life, but about choosing the heart that feels like home, even in the most unexpected of places. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to confirm your subscription and leave a like. It helps us a lot.